2, 1. Hey guys, welcome back to the HUKT podcast. I'm your host Kushaj. These are your other hosts, Umar, Hiren, and Tanay. And today we have a very special guest with us in order to do our climate change episode. So, Miss Yuan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Miss Yuan. I am a teacher at KG5 school, and I am a geologist and earth scientist by training. And I teach geography and environmental systems and societies at KG5.
Okay, great. Miss Yuan, starting us off, I've got a question. The previous podcast we did was about new technology up and coming. If you haven't seen that, check that out. But the first question I've got relating to climate change is, do you think that the development of green technology can help in reaching a level of sustainability, or are we beyond the tipping point?
Well, that's a huge question. I personally believe that already, I think it's already inevitable. Climate change is happening. The question is can we actually reduce or mitigate the impacts of climate change through green technologies is one potential way to do it. I think that green technologies will definitely be helpful. I think we don't really actually have much of a choice. I think we have to implement some of those. But I'm always a little bit skeptical of humans. Maybe I'm a bit of a pessimist, but I feel that we don't always understand and can't always control how natural systems actually work. And some of the technologies could be great, but some are a little bit more risky, in my opinion. Things like global dimming, or some people put together things like proposals for a network of mirrors in space. All of those things I'm a little bit more skeptical of in terms of the potential problems that could arise from putting those in place. Carbon capture is one of the ones that's been touted as the most feasible. And that's probably the way that a lot of mitigation might go. But even carbon capture has some potential for issues. So I think we have to put in place green technologies, but I think we need to be quite careful about how we do it.
Can you tell us a bit more about carbon capture and what that aims to achieve?
Okay, so carbon capture, the idea is that already we have so much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. We've got higher concentrations than we've ever had in, say, the last 500,000 years. In that time, we've never gone above, I think it was 300 parts per million, and we're now well above that. So we have to get some of that carbon out of the atmosphere and into one of the other stores. So if we can get it into the biosphere, into trees, or if we can get it underground into rock, that would be great. So carbon capture focuses on trying to pull that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and actually store it underground. And there are different ways it can happen, but one of them is that you store it underground as calcite, which is a type of kind of the building block of limestone, calcium carbonate. And they have some trial carbon capture plants in Iceland. Other ones try and use it to enhance plant growth. I'm not a huge expert on it, but I do know of those. Yeah, and that's the idea. Get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, put it somewhere else.
That's good. I feel like that is necessary moving forward because of the amount of problems which have risen from the burning of fossil fuels. I think just slowly getting it back to perhaps pre-industrial levels. I know that's quite a big ask, but at least working towards there is ideal. Now, moving on to the next question, we had a big event recently, COP26, in which it is very significant because it's quite important in the sense that it decides the future of our planet. And so I wanted to know, do you think that the promises made at COP26 will be fulfilled?
Again, I think I'm a bit of a pessimist. We've got not very much time left, and I don't really see governments. I don't really see governments making the moves to fulfill those promises. So from my pessimistic point of view, no, I don't think we'll fulfill them in time. I suspect that once the impacts of climate change start really pushing the envelopes, especially for the big polluting countries, when they start seeing some really bad impacts affecting their populations, then they might be spurred into action. But the question is how long are we willing to wait? How long are those governments and those people willing to wait before they say, you know what, we're sacrificing too much and we have to do something? When will those governments, when will their populations decide that we actually have an emergency on our hands?
Yeah.
So I think that we will struggle to hit COP26 agreements. And I think that's part of, again, this is pessimistic, part of human nature. We have a habit of not really acting until the last minute. We like to we're procrastinators. We like to keep the status quo, especially if it means that we can carry on economically expanding. And I think it will have to reach a point of real crisis before we start to think more altruistically and start thinking more about having to act towards the greater good.
Well, we've seen massive natural events take place in the last decade, really. With the massive forest fires in Australia, California, hurricanes across America. So how much more do we need to take before we can actually acknowledge what's going on and make some decisions to help mitigate this change?
I mean, that's a great question. That is the ultimate question, isn't it? How much are you willing to take? How much are those countries willing to absorb before it becomes too much? The big fear is that they'll wait until it's too late and it's too hard to recover from.
Yeah. So talking about, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, and unfortunately, the problem is that the countries that actually will suffer the most are the ones who have the least control over greenhouse gas emissions and reaching these goals.
Yeah, I was just about to ask that. Which countries, geographically, do you think will be most affected by these natural events occurring because of climate change? Are there any in particular?
I think all countries will be affected. I think your less developed countries are the most vulnerable because they have the least ability to prepare and prevent some of the potential bad impacts of climate change. And to recover from some of those things. They just don't have the money to do all those things, put mitigation into place. But particularly, low-lying countries will be at a risk because we have problems with, as the sea gets hotter, it expands, sea levels rise. So countries like Bangladesh, which 80% is low-lying on a floodplain, and the majority of which is within a meter of sea level. So they're going to get a lot more cyclones, a lot more floods. They also have a very high population density, and the majority of their population is not very wealthy. So I think Bangladesh will be particularly vulnerable. And then a lot of your small island developing nation states, they call them SIDS, small island developing nation states, ones that are low-lying, they don't have a lot of their own resources, and for that reason, they're not very wealthy either. So countries like Barbados, Mauritius, Tuvalu, Kiribati, these small island states that ironically are probably some of the least responsible for the causes of climate change will be the ones that suffer the most consequences from it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So just moving on from that, this ties into the ESS syllabus as well, but I wanted to know, in your opinion, which worldview would fare off best against climate change? An ecocentric, technocentric, or anthropocentric view?
You're asking me what I am, right? Am I mainly an ecocentric, an anthropocentrist, or a technocentrist? I think it will probably have to be a combination of all three if it's going to work. Ecocentric approaches where you really are looking at self-regulation and minimizing how much you mess with natural systems. In my opinion, that's ideal. Okay? The Earth system and our natural systems have taken billions of years to evolve and to come to some kind of dynamic equilibrium. So the ideal thing would be to try and work within that, really efficient and elegant system. But to be ecocentric, you have to have a society that basically thinks altruistically, thinks of others, and doesn't always focus on the self and what's best for you, but thinks instead about what's best for the entire community. And I think again we're essentially selfish. So for that reason, I think you have to have anthropocentric approaches. You have to have governments putting laws in place, making sure people behave, because otherwise they won't. And technocentric, I think, is kind of a way of trying to make everyone happy, because the technocentric approach will allow countries to continue to grow economically, because your solutions are ones that still allow for economic growth. They're just technological solutions that come up with better ways of dealing with the climate change problems. And since everybody wants to continue improving their quality of life, I think it's going to be hard to get people to say, yeah, we're going to cut down on resource use, or yes, we're going to deprive ourselves of something because it's better for the planet. So I think you probably need a combination of all three if you really want to make it work.
By the sounds of it, yeah, you're right, because that if we have all three of them put together, then that means it would fare off the best. Like, we have to remember that technocentric approach is also necessary, because that helps with the economy. An anthropocentric approach helps with making sure things are firmly regulated. So yeah, I think you're right about all three of them being needed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the technocentric approach is very, optimistic in the way that we're hoping that we'll develop our technologies in a way that can help us solve this crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're kind of putting it on the future, like hoping that we can actually develop the technologies in the way. So I think all three are really necessary to help us out, because it's a massive problem and it needs tackling, right?
Yeah.
So a combination of all three.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, carry on.
So I actually had a question that was sort of country specific. So it's been it's sort of a known fact that the ozone layer is basically, there's like a giant hole over Australia, right? So how responsible is it for causing climate change in Australia? Like, what do you think of that?
Well, actually, the ozone layer the ozone layer is not actually responsible for climate change. Oftentimes people equate the ozone hole with climate change, and actually they're not exactly the same thing. So ozone is important in the stratosphere for controlling the amount of UV light that gets in down to the surface. And it's really important there. We need it because if you don't have it, then you get more of the damaging UVB rays down to the surface. And that's why chances of getting skin cancer down in Australia and in the Southern Hemisphere are much higher. But its contribution to climate change is actually very small. Ozone itself is a greenhouse gas, but the way it works up in the stratosphere may actually lead to global cooling. So oftentimes I say to people, don't equate the ozone hole with climate change. They actually are slightly different issues. So actually the ozone hole itself, which was a big deal back in the 1980s, that's when it was kind of in the news a lot.
Yeah.
They did put in place the Montreal Protocol in 1987, which banned the use of CFCs. And those were ozone depleting substances, and we have seen it healing itself to a certain extent. There's still a hole there, and it kind of breathes, gets bigger and smaller. But we tend not to focus on ozone so much when it comes to climate change. We tend to focus more on carbon dioxide, which is the largest greenhouse gas in volume, and then methane and nitrous oxide.
Okay, thank you. I think Hiren's got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to bring it to something else, and I wanted to talk about coral reefs. I know coral reefs are also something big on the news, like in this generation especially, because now we hear that coral reefs are being affected and damaged. And I do think that climate change has a small part that also plays in this. Do you have any idea of what's going on with this? Because I remember watching like a David Attenborough documentary, and like I remember he brought up something about coral reefs, and then I think pushing on like over like 5-6 years, I see like new National Geographic ones where it's talking about the damages.
Yeah.
So what are your views on this?
That's really interesting. I just had a a year 10 class where somebody brought this up. They just watched, it was probably a David Attenborough video just today, and they were talking about just this. Unfortunately, global warming and warming of the climate is likely to lead to a mass die-off of corals, and we've already started to see this. So as you get more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and as the seas warm up, you'll find that more carbon dioxide actually gets dissolved into the water, into the seawater, and that makes it more acidic. So our seas are getting more acidic, and that's quite bad for corals because it causes the corals to expel the algae, which means that they can't photosynthesize. And so that's what makes them turn white, because the algae basically has been expelled, okay, and they can't photosynthesize anymore. So it basically kills them. And you get these massive coral bleaching events. And I think we were discussing today, I was saying to the class, I think it's something like a 40% die-off of the Great Barrier Reef. And one of the students said, no, Miss Yuan, I think it's more than that. I think it's up to 50% now. So I'm not sure what the current statistic is, but the Great Barrier Reef has lost a lot of coral in the last, I'd say, 20 years through this. Now that's a big problem because coral reefs do a lot of photosynthesis. If you want to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, do photosynthesis. So it's going to impact our ability to potentially reduce some of the climate change, but it's also going to have a massive impact on biodiversity in the oceans. And it's because corals are kind of the nursery grounds for a lot of fish, we're probably going to see big impact on the fish stocks that we have available, which means that there could be shortages in fish, basically. So that could impact our food supply as well. So lots of knock-on effects there.
I think that was really well explained, and I think you're right too. And to add on to what you're saying, I feel like it's like also these like chronic stressors, things like human activity, things like overfishing, or like the pollution we cause by creating various sort of technologies and like expanding on land. Oh, coastal development, I know that's a big thing.
Yeah,
And they're like I'd say those are one of like humans are also are part of the reason for the sort of destructions for some of these environmental aspects. Do you think that human activity also sort of contributes to this?
yeah, definitely. I think if you look at us, we've been on the planet for an extremely short period of time, if you look at it in terms of geologic history. And yet within that time, we have managed to disrupt the natural systems so much that we could well do our own species in. In the past, and Tanay and Umar, this is something that we will learn in ESS. In the past, there have been 5 mass extinctions. And these are caused by things like meteorite strikes and volcanic eruptions and major life extinction events. But we are now in the process of the 6th mass extinction. And if you actually look at the rate at which species are going extinct, it's something like 10,000 times faster than it normally would happen in nature. And it's basically caused by humans. So we actually call this extinction event the anthropogenic extinction event. It's caused by us. And yeah, I think we are responsible. We are one of the few species that can really modify our environment. Like I don't know of any species that's been able to modify its environment as much as we can. But we don't really understand it. And we don't really understand how it works. So we don't really understand what the impacts are of what we do. And that's very dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's massive. A lot for us to take in, and a lot for our viewers to understand as well. So I think that wraps up our segment. All the questions you've had have been answered greatly by Miss Yuan. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you very
Means a lot.
much.
Not at all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Industrial countries, and then the economics of it all, and then we're done.
Okay.
Let's go.
So let's start. Are you recording?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. 3, 2, 1.
Well, I'm not gonna lie, that was an absolutely brilliant section by Miss Yuan. It was all that knowledge that us ourselves, just students, we wouldn't have that kind of information. I think that was like great having a professional on here, up on our list with Harsh Gabramani, our esteemed experts list. And I think that next, what we should talk about is green technologies, because she mentioned about stuff like carbon capture, right, guys? So I think that we should look a little bit more into that. So, Hiren, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So in the last 15 years, people have become more aware through the media about climate change. And so the awareness about the environment has grown over the last decade or so. And so now we can see things like bikes, or like the Gobi bikes, for example, being used more often. So some of the gases, like the greenhouse gases that were mentioned earlier, from a design perspective, are used in mostly automotive designs. And so engineers have tackled this issue by trying to go for like more greener and more like environmentally friendly sort of designs and technologies, such as Tesla, etc., etc. And these sort of technologies use like low fuel usages, and the result of this is that the lower emissions from the increased use of electric power have more efficiency, and so these cars can do more without really affecting the environment as much as we used to have before. What is the conflict of this? Well, obviously, electric cars still use electricity that comes from a mix of emissions intensive fossil fuels, nuclear energy, and power from renewables. What do we think, guys?
I think, for example, I remember you listed one example of Gobi bikes, and I remember when those came to Hong Kong, then like, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I know that me and my family, we started using them because like using cycles instead of transport, while it might not get you very far if you just want to be a casual cycler, I mean, they are very useful, right? Like it cuts down the use of vehicles by a lot.
Yeah.
I think that I wasn't the huge user of the Gobi bikes when we came here. And that's because it just, it didn't feel seamless to me. It didn't sort of integrate into my lifestyle. I like sort of going really far or like cycling, that was never my thing. And I think like these green technologies, I feel like Gobi bikes, they're perfectly targeted to like a consumer base that's like hyperactive, right? But I feel like if you want to really make a dent in climate change, you're gonna want some sort of technology that is like global, affects everyone. Everyone can use it, everyone likes it, everyone's a fan. So I think Gobi bikes are good, but I don't know about getting everyone to transition onto bicycles, especially people who are obese, if you will.
I think it's different between Hong Kong and other places in the world, because like in Hong Kong you can't really bike to work, I think that's the main thing. You see in like London, you got the Boris bikes there, or not really called Boris bikes, but the Boris bikes there. Tons of people use them just to bike to work, school, stuff like that. So I think it really depends on where you're from, and I think just these local changes you can make, they all add up in the end, right? So I think every little bit helps. And hearing talking about Tesla and how like the electricity needed from those cars, they pretty much all come from the burning of fossil fuels. I think that's the overarching issue, that most of the energy we use for electricity actually comes from the burning of fossil fuels and not renewable sources like solar, wind, hydroelectric, stuff like that. So I think that's the primary source where it needs to be tackled, because if we can tackle the issue of fossil fuels and them being burnt, it solves all kind of problems for us.
Yeah, and I remember, Umar, you just listed something about how making small movements ultimately helps out. And I think that's what the whole recovery of climate change movement is about, right? I mean, we've reached a point where we're a bit too far beyond going back to normal, but small changes one by one do help out. I mean, that's what firms and that's what governments are trying to do in the world. You can't bring it all the way back to pre-industrial levels, but you can try and slowly make changes to at least bring us to a level of sustainability. So even something like implementing bicycles does help, because that's a small change which helps out.
Yeah.
Were you gonna say something?
Nope. Go ahead.
Okay. So I actually want to. So Tanay, you just mentioned, how you think that governments and firms, they're trying to sort of transition into this green economy, but I actually disagree. Like, I think governments are trying, but I think they're just doing mouth service to the people, right? So I think that the main way this is shown is in fossil fuel subsidies, right? So basically, governments out here handing cash to businesses to help them, produce more of their products. So for renewable technologies, I think in the US, it was like, I think it was around $100 million that the government put into subsidizing renewable energy, and then how much do you guys think that they put into subsidizing fossil fuels?
How much, mate?
Having a clue.
Okay, good guess. Thank you. I think it was around 300 million. They put a lot more into subsidizing fossil fuels than they did for renewables. It's because like I feel like the people we elect into office, there's sort of that monetary incentive for them. They're more interested about the next dollar than they are about the environment or the people, right? So I think like that's a major problem. It drives us to use the most efficient profit-making systems, not necessarily the ones which are the best for the environment. So I think that that's the problem with the technology. What do you think, Hiren?
Bro, I completely agree with that. I do think that there's this like problem that people want to use more sort of fossil fuel generated technology just because they're widely available and they can be used more often because there's already a sort of procedure into creating things like that, creating things and machines and cars that use those sort of technologies. And like the Gobi bike example we used, right? I remember like it was only here for like a year, almost like a year and like 3-something months, I think, the Gobi bikes. And like they stated like the reason for that was because of their financial situation. It's because they weren't able to make much profit out of it, and so it was like the condition like showed like it was just not, they didn't have enough profit and enough like sort of money to invest into their project and sort of build on it. And yeah,
I know, like, specifically with the example of Gobi bikes, I mean, even now around Tongchong, I do see some of these Gobi bikes just thrown inside bushes or something for, like, they've been abandoned for years, like, and I don't know why that's happened, but I've seen lots of broken ones when they were lasting, so, like, I mean, as far as that specific example goes, I'm not really sure what was happening with them, but, yeah, he wanted to feature himself in the episode, but, yeah, I mean, yeah, some of these solutions, they are, as Hiren said, they're quite costly because that's what these approaches require, right? They require lots of money because you're trying to change the entire way in which people function. So that does require lots of money.
Yeah, I think it's massive because it impacts everyone, around the world. You get like these stories about like climate change causing mass, I think we talked about this with Miss Yuan, like mass climate events that affect people in disastrous ways across the world. You get hurricanes, typhoons, forest fires, all of that. I think I saw a story, someone told me a while ago that there was this in Bosnia, if you guys saw this, there was like a massive earthquake there, and it pretty much it crippled the entire town village that it hit. And I don't know how true this is, but the only house that wasn't crippled by the earthquake was the house of a fortune teller, and he was the one who actually predicted that was going to happen. So the world works in mysterious ways.
That's quite
That's
quite a
coincidence.
coincidence. Yeah, as Kushaj said, that indeed is a coincidence. And like, you brought up this climate event. I mean, just for example, like I've heard that there's been some problems in the UK as well, as recent as yesterday with, I think there was a cyclone, and yeah, so like just. I know that my sister has been issued this order to like try and stay at home on Friday. I think there's something like that going on. So I mean, climate change events aren't just about the past. I mean, they're as recent as yesterday. So yeah. Those are a big issue.
I think like the real problem that we're getting right was why we already have all of the younger generation involved. Most people our age, they say they're climate activists and they care about environmental change, right? So I think you already have this giant fan base or of people who are dedicated to trying to stop climate change, but then you have these sort of older politicians and this older generation that's in charge right now, right? And you guys were mentioning about how you already have all of these you guys were mentioning about all the events that are happening globally. You have the wildfires, right? I think like despite all of this, right, I think the main reason that people aren't acting is because of the fact that it's sort of a silent killer, right? you don't really know if it's the environment naturally that's doing this, or if it is like it's just natural, or if it's enhanced by climate change. What
Yeah,
do you guys
man.
think?
Yeah.
Politicians, love them.
Politicians, man, a huge fan, electing them all the time. The
Mm.
politicians.
Yeah.
I'd like to just speak on that, and I'd like to link it to like human activity, because I believe that it is human activity. I think that's the major cause of this, because we're the ones, we're the ones creating the extra CO2 levels
Yeah.
from burning these fossil fuels to like the power stations and stuff like that. And so, just to give a quick summary, extraction such as ground level dropping, open cast mining leading to environmental degradation such as coastal coal mining, etc., crude or oil gas, which was made millions of years ago. We can see gas flares and spills from that. Drilling, which is the pressure into the Earth's crust, which causes explosions and hence millions of gallons of oil being spilled, which is destructive to land. And finally, climate change due to mining, overpopulation, expanding agriculture, which causes deforestation, etc., etc.
Well,
Hiren.
Yes.
Shoot, sorry. Where are you going? Oh, okay. Okay then. I see how it is. So, Hiren, you're mentioning all this stuff, right? Like overpopulation and fracking, but right now, we're kind of dependent on these. Like, we can transition away from these as fast as we want, but there's still going to be a time when we're dependent on these fossil fuels and all of that kind of shebang. And then there's also the overpopulation issue that you mentioned. Like, how do you propose we like solve that? Like, what do we just go straight purge style, or like I don't really think like there's really an sort of solution to the overpopulation problem apart from more efficient agriculture. What do you guys think?
Yeah. Just first of all, you're kind of dwelling into the universe behind you, so just be careful of that. And then, what you said about I think we've
Man's
lost
gone.
I'm
Kushaj,
the all
guys.
knowing man.
I'm afraid we've lost Kushaj. But
space
I think,
exploration.
we've got Elon Musk on our hand. But yeah, I think adding to what Kushaj said, he said something about how overpopulation is a crisis, or it's a problem which we can't really we can't really change, and like it has been a big problem recently because the world has seen such a big population I've seen the population level rise so much just in the last century, because we were at a point where like the population levels are very low, and if you look at early 1900s or so, but all of a sudden we've reached this stage where we're barely able to sustain ourselves, and there isn't really a solution to this in the present day. I mean, certain governments I've heard have tried to control the birth rate by like placing laws on how many kids a family can have. Like that is one thing, but as far as the current level of population goes, we can't really control that, right? So we just have to make do with what we have.
Yeah,
I feel like there might be like a potential solution though on the horizon, right? Most of the world is like developed, or at least is developing, right? They have good agricultural output, but I feel like an area that's like really underutilized, and I think that's like the African continent, right? So I know how like the northern half of Africa is just the Sahara Desert, but that's a great place where you could potentially do some solar farming, right? Not a large scale solar farm, because there are definitely issues logistically with that, but small scale solar farms there would definitely be a huge plus. And I think that there's not much agricultural development in Africa itself, I mean, it's just a fact, right? So I think that if we developed Africa more, or like put more money into Africa, I feel like the feeding problem, or like food production, could definitely be helped, or at least solved.
Yeah, agreed. But the thing is, that begs the question: are these countries like willing to take on this responsibility? Countries like what, Algeria, Egypt, any countries in the north of Africa, really, are they willing to take on these responsibilities of helping the world? And what's in it for them, really? I mean, how does that benefit them economically?
Well, if you have a starving population, I'm sure there's a giant demand for food globally if you're producing food. So I feel like that asset on its own.
Well,
if you're
yeah, but I
producing
mean,
food and people are starving.
they're starving for a reason, though. They're starving because they don't have the finance to actually get these operations going. So they need external sources of finance.
Yeah, you definitely do need these external sources of finance, right? And it's up to these developed countries to hand it down. But there is also actually stuff in it for these developed countries, because you can have countries which are indebted to your favors. You gain influence in a rising continent, or like a continent of rising powers, right? And that kind of influence is going to play well in the future, right? So if you're really thinking long term, I feel like Africa is the way to go if you want to develop, or if you want to develop your assets overall as a nation. What do you guys think?
I think first of all, I'd like to go back to what Umar said about what's in it for the countries, for these Northern African countries, and I think that's one of the biggest problems with these current climate events, like these conferences like COP26, which are taking place, because you've got the nations which have already developed themselves, and then you've got the nations which haven't. So the nations which haven't are trying to fight for their chance to get to develop themselves, while the nations who have developed are imposing rules such as, let's control the climate. But they've already maximized production and gotten their economic gains, but now they're trying to impose rules on the countries which haven't done that yet. So it really brings a question about fairness into the discussion, that, like, can you impose rules like this on the countries which haven't developed when the countries who have developed have already, developed? Like, how can you all of a sudden tell the undeveloped countries to stop production when they don't get a chance to be like the other countries?
Well, yeah, exactly. It's these massive countries, your Americas, China's, Russia's, Great Britain's, Japan. They're already developed, and they're the reason why we've got this problem of climate change, because of their burning of fossil fuels. I think Miss Yuan touched on it earlier. It's these smaller countries that are paying the price for it, because they're not being allowed to develop, really, because of international sanctions and international agreements.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite unfair on these developing countries, because they can't reach this maximum industrial output, because they're being restrained this way, and they're not getting much help from these massive countries technologically. So it begs the question, who's really responsible for climate change, these big countries or the industrial countries who are just trying to get their output up and grow economically? Hiren?
Yeah, I think I sort of agree with you on that. Like, I do think that yes, it is the developed countries have obviously not sorted this thing out 100% in their own spaces and communities, but it's also the low developing countries, because, like, I know places like India, for example, there's a high density of population, like, in every space. We see so much overpopulation, and so because they're not able to integrate all these sort of new greener technologies, such as cars like Tesla, into their own country, it's becoming more hard for them to also sort of move there. And so they're also still using technologies that sort of utilize the fossil fuels and things like that, which also makes it harder for us to say which one to blame on, because it seems like it's kind of a bit of all of them. It's sort of like a shared problem around the world, like global warming, for example.
Yeah.
What do you guys think?
I mean, what you said especially makes sense, that now the countries which have already industrialized, which have already furthered their economy, now they're placing rules on the countries which haven't done that yet. So it's easy for the countries which have already industrialized to say, okay, we're done, let's just stop polluting, let's just live a pollution-free life. But that's not so easy for the countries which rely on things like burning fossil fuels to further their economy, because they haven't reached a position where they're developed yet. Like, for example, Bangladesh is one of the they've got I know that they're heavy in industry, and they produce a lot, but they haven't reached their highest level as an economy yet. But if you stop them from producing, is that really fair? Because it's kind of like a equality versus equity question, where it's like you're trying to place the same rules on the people who haven't developed as a developed country already. So that's where it's quite a ethical question.
I think that there is a solution to this, but for all the listeners or viewers of this podcast, I'm just a high school kid, so I have probably negative idea what I'm talking about. But I feel like if you got a body like the United Nations, right, and if you got global funding from every country in the world, you could ask them to contribute a proportional amount of their GDP to helping fight climate change, and then this sort of money could be redistributed globally to countries that need it the most. Like in India, it's unfair to ask a country that has millions in poverty to start spending money on all this advanced green technology, right? So I feel like honestly, if you spread that sort of pain, or not really pain, but if you sort of spread the money out, right, it would definitely go a long way towards helping all of these developing countries fight climate change and just helping everyone in general. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think definitely, but I mean, it's a lot of personal gain. It's a lot of geopolitics. These politicians. I mean, unless you've got countries like the US where there's a lot of societal pressure on their leaders to actually fight for climate change, you don't really get much of it apart from the US, maybe the UK, because what's in it? What's in it for the leaders? They're just there to see through their term and try to get another one. So how does it help them with tackling climate change when they could just be bettering the economy? That's what gets them the votes, and that's what gets them in office. So there's not really much benefit for them.
I think you've raised a good point there, and I feel like that's what the general mentality towards climate change is. Like, why people have taken so long to realize. It's like, I think there's a common mindset that if it's not personally affecting you, you don't need to worry about an issue. Because, like, if, like, us four in our rooms right now, we aren't feeling the effects of climate change while we're on this podcast, are we? There's no visible effects, but that might be a mindset which most people employ, that like, oh, if it's not affecting me or if it's not affecting the country, you don't need to worry about this, such as what Trump believed in throughout his whole term. But I think that's where the politicians need to be bigger than themselves, and they need to think about the lasting impact which it'll have. I mean, they'll do their term, then they'll like say that I've served as the president, but like that's where they've got to, like make their change, or they've got to do their roles, because it might not affect them in their current term, but then it will. I mean, as Miss Yuan said, that they will affect them very soon. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that gives a lot to think about for our viewers. How they can make a change individually. We talked about the Gobi bikes. We talked about big countries. So I think that gives us some real insight. And obviously through Miss Yuan, we've bettered our understanding. Hopefully bettered your understanding, everyone at home. So I think wrapping up our third episode now. Kushaj, you want to see us through?
Yeah. So thank you guys so much for listening. We've gained a solid 5 subscribers since our last episode. We'd like to thank all 5 of you people personally for subscribing to our podcast. We greatly appreciate it. We'll take every subscriber and view that we can get. So thanks so much for listening. And of course, if you want, our @ is HUKT Podcast on Instagram, and on YouTube it is It's HUKT as well. And hope to see you guys next time. And of course, if you want to be a specialist, or if you think that you have a specialist, you can of course DM us on Instagram or mail us at HUKT Podcast.
We do aim to work on global issues, but whatever you want, even if you just have something in mind, feel free to let us know through our Instagram or through our email, and we'll be sure to get back to you.
Suggestions are very helpful for us. So thank you, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.